With the fall of Berlin Wall and the collapse of Warsaw Pact came the end to the Cold War. After the failure of communism and collapse of the Soviet Union, it was thought that all former Soviet states, including Russia, will join the West and European community. It was thought that Russia will go under some radical changes to distance itself from communism and move itself closer to democratic society. And indeed there were some efforts in this regard, such as, for example, the inclusion of Russia in the European Council and the G7, or partnership programs between Russia and NATO regarding important strategic decisions and joint cooperation between the United States and Russia against terrorism. And although Soviet Union collapsed, its beliefs, memories, culture, values, and institutions still remained in Russia. The West emerged victorious from the Cold War, and Russia came out as a country that lost 23.8% of its territory, 48.5% of its population, and 41% of its GDP. Russia also lost 44.6% of its military potential, but still remained the country with biggest nuclear arsenal in the world. The Western powers began looking at Russia as a regional power instead of a superpower it once was. With Russia weakened, West, and especially the United States, have become a global police officer, enforcing its will on other nations of the world. Russia's goals were to restore its former glory and to bring all Russian people from other former Soviet states in one united Russian state, while the goals of the West were to push the Iron Curtain all the way to the border of Russia and to bring all former Soviet states under its sphere of influence. Second Cold War was slowly beginning to emerge from the ashes of the first one. Majority of former Soviet states and satellite states began to distance themselves from Russia and its influence, in fear of Russian intentions to reclaim the lands it once occupied. NATO broke the promise of not expanding further east, given to General Secretary Gorbachev after unification of East and West Germany.
The important thing is that NATO is going to expand, and we're going to do it in a deliberate fashion, in an open fashion, as we have said all along.
In 1999, Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary joined NATO. Shortly after that, in 2004, 7 more countries joined NATO, including 3 former Soviet states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, which was a major blow to Russia, because now it was sharing a border with NATO countries. The expansion didn't stop there, because in following years, Croatia, Albania, Montenegro, and North Macedonia also joined the alliance. And while NATO and EU were expanding towards east, Russia began to spread its influence towards the south. Russia formed Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is practically a Russian version of NATO alliance that includes Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. Russia and Belarus also formed the Union State of Russia and Belarus, with further aims of economic and military cooperation. But in reality, it meant that Belarus became a puppet state of Russia. With formation of BRICS, Russia also further strengthened economic relations between China, India, South Africa, and Brazil, which opened a vast market for sale of its products and natural resources like oil and gas. Unfortunately, Second Cold War, like the first one, doesn't only consist of peaceful formation and expansion of economic and military alliances. Second Cold War is a hybrid war which consists of diplomatic conflicts, economic wars, sanctions, cyber attacks, election rigging, assassinations, and most devastating of all, proxy wars between 2 opposing sides of the world. First of those wars was war in Kosovo in 1999. It opened the Pandora's box and became a place where Second Cold War started. Conflict in Kosovo began in 1998 when terrorist organization called Kosovo Liberation Army, or UČK, started attacking Serbian civilians who were living in the area in order to separate Kosovo from Serbia and to make Greater Albania. President of Serbia at the time, Slobodan Milošević, ordered Serbian police and army to stop terrorist attacks and protect civilians. And although UČK was an American list of terrorist organizations, America supported UČK, who staged the massacre of Albanian civilians in a place called Račak. United States and its allies accused Serbia of creating humanitarian disaster and ethnic cleansing and started bombing Serbia on March 24, 1999, without permission of UN Security Council. Serbia, a country that fought with allies against Germany in both world wars, was now attacked without any provocation and reason by its former allies.
If President Milošević will not make peace, we will limit his ability to make war.
When I was in your position, I was suggesting we bomb Belgrade. I was suggesting that we send American pilots in and blow up all the bridges on the Drina. I was suggesting we take out his oil supplies. I was suggesting very specific action.
In 78 days of bombing, United States with its NATO allies killed over 3,500 and expelled over 200,000 Serbian civilians from Kosovo. In addition to civilian casualties, NATO also made $30 to $100 billion in damages and used illegal weapons containing depleted uranium. Peace was signed on 10th of June 1999, and in 2008, Kosovo declared independence from Serbia, which was supported by Western powers. Russia couldn't do anything for its ally Serbia while the war in Kosovo was raging. She was too weak both economically and militarily to support Serbia in any way except in diplomatic protests against illegal bombing. United States and its NATO allies broke the international law and unintentionally made the Kosovo precedent, which allowed any region of any country to separate without permission of the whole country. After Kosovo War, Russia realized that NATO is not a defensive alliance, and that danger from NATO grows larger every day. Sadly, war in Kosovo was just first among many proxy wars between NATO and Russia. At the end of 20th century, Russian Federation was both economically and politically too weak to contest the West in any shape or form. All of Russian military equipment and vehicles were outdated, and all attempts to bring back Russia on its feet failed. Russia needed a strong leader. Then in year 2000, Vladimir Putin came to power. He promised people of Russia that he'll bring back order, economic prosperity, and the title of great power back to Russia. Instead of all that, he brought back dictatorship with an illusion of democratic governance. Immediately after coming to power, Putin intensified war in Chechnya against Chechen terrorists who were responsible for attacks, kidnapping, and murder of civilians in Russian Republic of Dagestan and various other places across Russia. During the war, 250,000 people were expelled from Grozny, the capital of separatist region of Chechnya. It is estimated that 200,000 people, a fifth of all Chechen population, was missing after the war, which ended in 2009. Initially, West was heavily protesting against Putin and his way of combating domestic terrorism, but that soon changed when the United States itself became a target of terrorists. After the attacks of 9/11, United States declared war on terror and fought against Taliban in Afghanistan for 20 years, from 2001 to 2021. In 2003, United States and its allies declared war on Iraq under a belief of existence of weapons of mass destruction. In reality, there were no weapons of mass destruction. But there was something much more important for the United States. Oil. Lots and lots of oil. It is estimated that the United States and its allies are responsible for over 1 million deaths in Iraq. In 2011, the United States intervened in Libya and ensured the collapse of regime of Muammar al-Gaddafi. With takedown of Gaddafi, USA only brought even more chaos to the Libya. And while USA and other Western powers were too busy destroying Middle East, Moscow was preparing to destabilize every former Soviet state with considerable Russian population. In the ethnic conflicts in the neighborhood of Russia, 3 unrecognized states were created in which Russia established a predominant influence. Countries like Moldova, Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan do not fully control their territories. Moldova has a problem with separatist region called Transnistria, located between the Dniester River and Ukrainian border, while Armenia and Azerbaijan are fighting over Nagorno-Karabakh, enclave in Azerbaijan with a majority Armenian population. Georgia was also having its own problems, especially in the separatist regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. In the summer of 2008, Georgia tried to bring back those 2 separatist regions under its control by bombing Chinvali, the capital of South Ossetia. Moscow quickly intervened, and 40,000 Russian troops entered Georgia. Soon the peace was signed, and Moscow used Kosovo precedent to support the independence of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Same thing that happened to Serbia in 1999 happened to Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. But this time, Russia was one to blame. After small victories in neighboring countries, Putin turned his attention to Middle East and the rest of the world to ensure even more influence on countries which haven't picked any side yet. On 15th of March 2011, civil war broke out in Syria, and soon after, Turkey, Russia, USA, and Iran joined the war, with each country supporting its own side. While Moscow was supporting Bashar al-Assad, United States supported opposition groups which were not part of Islamic State. After years of conflict, Putin managed to retain Bashar al-Assad in power. Syria is not only important for its strategic prestige, Russia also intended to station its naval and air forces in eastern Mediterranean. Putin made Russia a pro-class force in Middle East, secured an equal place among world powers in all important international forums, and opened important access to the Mediterranean. He also helped to create migrant crisis, which was a major blow to European Union. He improved relations with Turkey and President Erdogan, and spread Russian influence in Latin America, in countries like Cuba, Venezuela, Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil. It was clear that both East and West were becoming more desperate and aggressive in their ways to impose their will on others and to defeat the other side. It was time for the final showdown between these two opposing sides of the world. The place which that showdown took place was Ukraine, the second largest European country after Russia. Covering approximately 600,000 square kilometers, it has a population of around 40 million people, of which more than 8 million are ethnic Russians. In one of his more recent interviews, Putin was explaining his belief that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, divided artificially by borders and outsiders, and that Ukraine never had a tradition of genuine statehood. Putin saw Ukraine and its people as a legitimate part of Russia and its sphere of influence. In his eyes, securing Ukraine would mean the end of NATO's eastward expansion, and it would also mean that the Iron Curtain would now be located on the border with Poland and not on the border with Russia, as NATO had planned. First of those conflicts started already in 2004 in form of rigging of presidential elections. In July 2004, Putin publicly supported pro-Russian presidential candidate Viktor Yanukovych, while Western powers supported his main rival, Viktor Yushchenko. The second round of presidential elections was held on November 21st, where the Supreme Court of Ukraine declared the victory of Yanukovych with 49.46% of the vote, compared to 46.6% of the vote for Viktor Yushchenko. The day after election, the Orange Revolution began. Protesters gathered on the Maidan and occupied government buildings. The European Union strongly condemned Putin's involvement in elections and supported the protesters. New election that was held on December 26th brought victory to Viktor Yushchenko with 52% of the votes. For Putin, Ukraine, which was turning to the west, became a two-pronged challenge, both for Russian foreign policy interests and for its own survival. The victory of pro-European candidate further hardened Putin's attitude towards Ukraine and the EU. But luck soon turned in Putin's favor when the same Viktor Yanukovych, who was the pro-Russian candidate in 2004, won the presidential elections in Ukraine in 2010. Yanukovych won the election, demanding a return to close cooperation with Russia. He promised that Ukraine will not seek NATO membership, and Putin got a new opportunity to assert his influence. Everything went downhill when, in 2013, Yanukovych suspended negotiations on Ukraine's accession to the European Union. With the support of the West, 100,000 demonstrators took the streets of Kiev. 3 months later, that number increased to 800,000 demonstrators. As the demonstrations continued, the government's response became increasingly violent, to the point where police started killing demonstrators. While the demonstrations were raging on in the capital of Ukraine, President Yanukovych fled to Rostov. Parties of opposition immediately announced formation of new government and scheduled the new presidential elections. Putin could not allow himself to lose Ukraine for the second time. He accused the EU of trying to draw Ukraine into its sphere of interest and ordered military exercises near the border with Ukraine. Russia shocked the world when, on March 1, 2014, Russian troops suddenly, and without provocation, entered and occupied Crimean Peninsula. Then a referendum was held, in which citizens of Crimea declared that they wanted to become part of Russian Federation. EU never recognized the illegal referendum that was held in Crimea, with a large presence of armed Russian soldiers. Putin felt the weakness of European Union to oppose Russia in any way, so in May 2014, he supported the separatist regions of Donetsk and Lugansk, located in southeastern part of Ukraine. Groups of Russian military veterans, intelligence officers, mercenaries, and Chechens made up paramilitary formations that entered Ukraine with the aim of separating Donetsk and Lugansk regions from Ukraine. During the Russian annexation of Crimea and aggression against Ukraine, more than 10,000 people died, and more than 2 million escaped. Things took a drastic turn for the worst in February 2022, when Russia again used Kosovo precedent and recognized the independence of Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. Putin ordered a full-scale military invasion of Ukraine, ensuring even more death and destruction across the whole country. The war in Ukraine became the biggest conflict on European soil after the end of World War II. It is a war that is still going on at the time of making this video, and it is a war that, like any other, cannot be so easily predicted. NATO and EU sided with Ukraine and helped it by sending it military and economic aid. The war in Ukraine also led to problems in Russia, which became the most sanctioned country in the history of the world. High inflation and shortages of gas, oil, and wheat became problems with which the whole world had to face. Furthermore, NATO had increased its presence in Europe with the aim of accepting Sweden and Finland into the alliance. Tensions between Russia and NATO are at their highest level since the end of the Cold War and will continue to rise as the war in Ukraine unfolds. The Second Cold War is a conflict between the West and the East that has been going on for more than 20 years and in which there is no clear winner so far. During this conflict, it became clear that international law means nothing, that great powers respect only the law of the stronger, and that democracy is just a fancy word for dictatorship. Despite all the differences that exist between East and the West, they have one thing in common, that they have led to disintegration and destruction of many countries. They are responsible for millions of displaced and murdered people around the world and destruction of countless lives. It has become clear that both East and West are spreading their influence and destruction around the world and that the Second Cold War is getting hotter. Let's just hope that it doesn't get too hot, because if it does, it might be the end of us all.